Good morning to you all. We will start the proceedings of our second day of this symposium, and we will start today with a public lecture by Dr. Nadim Rouhana under the title Zionism and the Dilemma of Legitimizing Settler Colonialism, Religious Discourse as a Response to the Palestinian Resistance. Dr. Rouhana is very humble indeed. He asked me not to introduce him in a long way, but I have to say something at least. There are people who are following us on the Facebook and other platforms. They would like to know Dr. Nadim Rouhana. He is a lecturer at Faris Center at Fletcher School in Boston in the United States, and he is a member of the faculty at the Harvard University in the United States, and he holds a PhD from the United States, and he has many publications and papers, mostly pertaining to the Palestinian-Israeli struggle and the Palestinian and Israeli societies and the dynamism of this long social struggle between the two sides. I'll mention some of his books or publications, or the latest thing that was published for him in English was when the Palestinian and Israel readings in history, politics, and society, and in addition with Nadra Shahlub about Israel and its Palestinian citizens, ethnic privileges in the Jewish state, and also another title in Arabic, which can be translated to the Palestinians in Israel, readings in history, politics, and society. I thank Dr. Rouhana for being with us this morning. He was the guest editor of the special issue of Umran. I invite him now to deliver his lecture. Good morning all, and first of all I'd like to thank the organizers of this symposium, and thanks to Dr. Mouldi Lahmar for this kind introduction. My intervention today is on Zionism and their religious claims and the role of these claims in facilitating the colonial aspect of and we will discover towards the end of this lecture that the settler Zionism and colonialism in Israel has similarities and differences compared to other similar cases. For example, yesterday in Dr. Mahmoud Namdani's lecture about the South African experience and the American experience, I will one of the things I will ask, was the apartheid regime founded on religious principles similarly to Zionism? And what is the difference and relationships, the similarities between this and the experience of the Zionism in Palestine. In Zionism as a settler colonial project, I will allude to through three main ideas. First of all, religious claims in Zionism is a necessity and not a choice. Zionism does not have a choice but to resort to this kind of discourse. Secondly, part of this, the spread of these ideas amongst the um, political activities is the Palestinian agency, which still rejects the legitimacy of Zionism and colonial settler project. Also, thirdly, from the point of view of trying to establish the project, it will be difficult to do it without resorting to these religious claims. In 2019, in April 2019, during the deliberations of the Security Council, Danny Danon, the Israeli representative at the UN, defended the Jewish right in quotations marks to defend the Israeli right to the settlements in the West Bank, and he, although he is not religious, he raised the Torah in his right hand, and the religious hat that Jewish people meet says this is the deed of legitimacy. This is when God made his promise to Abraham, and he quoted the Old Testament that in it he says that God has promised the promised land to Abraham and his descendants, etc., etc. It appeared as if he was providing justifications for the prime minister at the time, Benjamin Netanyahu, to legitimize and annex the settlements legally to the state of Israel in the West Bank. And he used the main pillar of proving the legitimacy of Israel's claims as being the Torah, or the religious book of the Jewish faith. When a secularist person resorts to the Old Testament before the United Nations, represent really the necessity of Zionism feeling it necessary to rely on the religious claims to justify their claims to colonialize. And this is the same whether we're talking about the followers of Zionism or the ones who are not, who are approached outside. The three main components here we're talking about is, and the intersection between them and the interaction between them in the context of the... bring the mic closer to him. The mic is there and he's speaking here. He should be. And Zionism as a colonial project the settler colonial projects because settler colonial regimes lack in legitimacy, and the consequences of that will impact the Palestinians. We may come back to this point later on. Therefore, there is a pertinent question, which is a political question in essence, that any such project lacking legitimacy will require Israel to hide the essence of its project and provide claims of legitimacy to cover it. As for the Palestinians, as long as the Zionist project is a colonialist one, and it's based on displacement and replacement, the vast majority of Palestinians realized from the end of 19th century that a Zionist Jew who comes to Israel has not come as an immigrant or a resident, but as Memdani said, he came as a settler to start a settler project. And also the analysis used in the Palestinian literature and the oral history literature and other expressions of politics and culture has expressed an understanding of this struggle as a settler colonialism form of settlement. Briefly, after the establishment of the PLO and the rejuvenation of the Palestinian national movement, the discourse continued not only at the cultural level but at the political level too. The program was based on return and liberation, although the Palestinian political program did not specify the type of relationship which will govern the relations between Arabs and Jews. In parallel to this course, the Palestinian academic writings appeared, and a number of colleagues have written about that. This kind of academic theorization was a colonial one on the settler colonial settlement in Palestine. But when the PLO moved towards a policy of establishing a state in the 70s, another module appeared which presumed that the struggle between the Palestinians and the Israelis was a nationalist one. This appeared in the program of 10 points, then later on in the Oslo Accords, when the PLO tried to achieve the so-called two-state solution. And we noticed that the discourse, not only the political discourse, but the academic discourse has seen a retreat in both cases. Then later on, a paradigm of settler colonialism came back, led by Palestinian and international scholars. Some of them are here with us today, and this paradigm gradually became a political framework and has become a dominant discourse regarding the Palestinian cause, and this was as a result of the efforts exerted by a number of scholars and researchers. One of the characteristics that distinguished the colonial project as a settler project was manifested in the fact that its aim and is based on establishing an exclusive Jewish state for Jewish people, and this colonial settler project is probably the only one which has total support from the West to legitimize this colonial objective in the Western discourse. In any event, I will not elaborate so far as the characteristics are concerned. I'll mention two because they are related to the religious legitimization. First of all, the Zionist colonial project in Palestine continues, and in this sense, Israel as a state is still a project which has not been completed. The borders are not defined. They don't do that. Their capital is not recognized except by very few countries, and as this recognition is considered by the UN as null and void, and also no country in the world recognizes Israel's sovereignty on the areas territories occupied in '67 as occupied territories, and internationally there is no recognition of that. There is rejection of Israel's legitimacy from the neighbors of Israel on the basis that it's a Jewish state, and also its own citizens who are non-Jewish reside inside Israel, and the ones referred to as the Palestinians of 1948. But what is equally important is many of the Israelis do not see the future of Israel as a Jewish state the way it's presented now as a guaranteed future. Secondly, the other distinguishing aspect which is related to legitimacy and the religious discourse, Zionism has strived to promote as a colonial settler project at a time when this theory or this practice was waning in the world and weakening, yet the Zionist movement continued moving in a direction opposite to the direction of history to establish a people with every aspect of existence which is not different than the neighboring countries, but the delay faced in achieving this project has seen a lot of rejection at the international level, at least at the level, not the level of official states and governments, but at the level of public opinion, because the continuity of this project is directly linked to legitimacy and the need for legitimacy. In my opinion, Zionism is not just a colonial project. Maybe some people will disagree with me. It's more than that. But it's a liberation movement, but not in the sense that's understood in the world. It did not struggle to liberate a people from an occupying outside power. The Zionists call themselves liberators. They led the liberation movement from Britain. In achieving that, they needed the help of colonial powers, including Britain. So therefore, Zionism is the nationality of a settler colonial movement, which is different than liberation movements. Despite the fact that Zionism has tried to deal the horrible treatment of Europe of the Jews, which was culminated in the Holocaust, yet their struggle was not directed towards any European powers. It was directed on other peoples, on other lands, Uganda and Palestine. We will benefit from Dr. Mandani's presence here with us to maybe elaborate on that aspect. It's important to mention here that the dire consequences for Zionism is that Zionism was not going to achieve sovereignty on the ground and the status of state without becoming a colonial settler movement and project, whether this was to take place in Palestine or elsewhere.
Zionism is a settler colonialist movement. It has exploited some forces that are based on certain ethnicities rather than nationality, and those potentially allowing the transformation into becoming a political movement based on citizenship. And this was far-fetched because there is no Israeli nation or ethnicity in accordance with the ICJ. A number of Israelis went to the International Court of Justice and they wanted for them to be accepted as Israelis. The Supreme Court has refused, and it says that there is no Jewish ethnicity, but this is a long story. I'll move to Zionism and the religious discourse. Unlike the Christian Zionist extremist movements that are considered political, Zionism represents one of the most extremist movements whereby the religious merges with the nationalist, the Hidutva and the Serbian nationality and other comparisons. And in order to understand this interlink, the religion, the Jewish religion, tantamount to the nationality itself. So if you are a Jew, then you are a nationalist. Perhaps the political more important manifestation of this interlink between religion and nationality and settler colonialism is the claim that Zionism, in accordance with a divine promise, Palestine is the homeland of the Jews. And in accordance with such claim, this convoluted and close interlink makes the policies of the government justifiable, religiously speaking, and and it has been clear that the metaphor and the religious texts have been used as tools for the purposes of settler colonialism in Northern America, in South Africa, in Ireland, and in other countries. However, Zionism has been peculiar as far as this very issue. Unlike other settler colonial projects, Zionism exploited the fact that there is a cultural link between the Jews and the land of Palestine. This might be contentious, but they say that culture and religion are two faces to the same coin, and Palestine is the landscape. Unlike the other settler colonialist projects that relate to different political paths and historicity, whereby they dispensed with religion and resorted to different justifications, like having a citizenship system, resorting to democracy. However, Zionism has been entrenched in religion and still is. So the issue has been transformed into a political right. The issue has nothing to do with this interlink per se. And it is an irony for the secular Zionist movement to hinge on religion. This is the main irony. Secular Zionism has utilized religion or religious claims, if I would like to be more kind of accurate, because it is a secular movement. The core of Zionism, in accordance with the perspective of its founders, has been to do with focusing on the religious dimension and to transform it into becoming a political right. This claim has become the central plank of legitimizing the state of Israel and its establishment since Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion, for example, as historians know, when he in 1937 spoke before the British Royal Committee, said that Torah is our mandate. It has nothing to do with the British mandate. It is the Torah that provides us with the right. And Benjamin Netanyahu as well, in 2011, before the Congress, he had a speech and he talked about the core relationship between the Torah and the West Bank. And he was extremely religious in his speech, as Danon at the Security Council did. So this secular ambassador of Israel to the Security Council, when he alluded to religion, he emulates obviously the secular Zionist men. I'd like to focus on the following. Researchers who deal with the relationship between Israel and religion, they don't mention obviously the settler colonialist project, but when they deal with this link, they talk about the 1948 era following the 1967 era as if it has been the secular period of Israel. I think this is inaccurate because during that period, we would like to look at the necessary component of establishing a state, in brief, demographic hegemony to control the land and the exclusive sovereignty of the state. These are three important components of any state. Zionism hinges on the religious term of references as well as the religious claims and the religious discourse. I'd like to give you a simple example. Transfers is used metaphorically to mean ethnic cleansing, but it has to do with the religion. The redemption of the land relates to the religion, the exclusive Jewish state, and the act of nationality in the Knesset that has been passed recently justifies the exclusivity of the Jewish state. As some researchers, Israelis and non-Israelis, claim that that period has been secular, no, it hasn't. The religious claims have been ubiquitous, and indeed they are still, especially the ones that justify the dissemination of settlements and the settler colonialist project. This has been contentious as far as the emergence of the religious component. Indeed, this emergence of this religious component has been rarely linked to the characteristics of the settler colonialist project of Zionism. I think that the two are interlinked. The religious justification, the religious legitimacy, and the religious component all do have intrinsic links with the Zionist settler colonialist project. Studies dealt with the emergence of the religious discourse as far as the relationship between the Israelis and the religious sites in Palestine. And this has emphasized the religious discourse, and I think this has coincided with the emergence of the religious component, but the relationship is not causal. The the settler colonialist project in the West Bank hasn't started with the religious forces in Israel, the ones who started to build settlements in the 1967 West Bank are the Labour parties and the other secular parties in Israel. The Labour Party has annexed the East Jerusalem, and indeed settlements expanded up until 1977 under the helm or under the control of the Labour Party and then the other secular parties following 1977. Supporting this expansion continued during the other Labour parties that took the helm of power at a later stage as well. So uh, it's nothing to do with the religious forces. I think blaming the religious movements or forces directly or indirectly is a justification for Zionism. And I think it is erroneous, advertently or otherwise. I think this has been an attempt to disguise the real reason. Let's talk about the reasons of the emphasis on the religious component. I think that there are two missing links here. The first, just to clarify the need for religious legitimacy, I would like to give you an example about Uganda in order to clarify this point. Let's imagine that Theodore Herzl's proposal has been or has taken place in Argentina, or Australia, or Uganda, following the sixth Jewish Congress in Basel, and these issues have been deliberated indeed. Let's suppose that this proposal has been accepted. I'd like to ask, how can we suppose that the Ugandans would deal with this project? Obviously, they will be resisting such project. However, do we think that it will be ferocious as the Palestinian resistance? This is a question. But there is another question. What can the Jews do to legitimize their presence in Uganda. I think that they won't be relying on the divine promise. Most probably, Israel would have been a racist state on a par with the apartheid system in South Africa. So there was no justification as far as Uganda is concerned. So if we imagine the Jewish state in Uganda, I think that the legitimacy of such state would have been faulty. If I come back to Palestine, uh, the settlement expansions project is different. If this project would have been failing in Uganda, I think in Palestine, obviously, it is totally different. The more the demands are entrenched, especially in the West Bank and in the 1948 areas, the more the Jews depend or rely on the divine promise and the religious claims. It is essential not only for the internal legitimacy of the settlers, but for addressing the international community and the other victims. So this theoretical exercise uh, uh, clarifies the need for Israel to rely on such religious claims. There's also another important element, and it is to do with the Palestinian agency, the Palestinian resistance. I think that in accordance with different studies of the settler colonialism, there is a focus on the structure, and this is correct. Everyone who writes about this very subject says that it is a structure, it's a structural transformation rather than a one-off kind of event that took place during a certain period. Patrick Wolf, the late Patrick Wolf, the occupiers, settlers come to the land to live on structurally, if I might say. However, there is a disregard to the process. Yes, the process of the settler colonialist project, and it is to do with the uh, agency of the occupied. Sometimes it determines what the occupier does and how the occupier deals with the occupied. So the structure alludes to the governing principles. The process alludes to resistance and the agency of the Palestinians. So when we apply the process on the colonialist reality in Palestine, we discover that the period that has been called secular, there was no need as far as the process of the Palestinian resistance is concerned. There was no need to resort to the divine promise. In 1948, we were defeated. We went into the neighboring countries. The Palestinians have lived in the diaspora, so the Israelis did not need this religious component. However, later on, when the Palestinians took the bull from its horn, if I might say, and they resorted to resistance. Obviously, the Jews were victims of the Holocaust. The Soviet Union and the United States of America recognized the state of Israel and so on and so forth at the beginning. However, later on, when the Palestinian resistance emerged, and refused the legitimacy of the Jewish state and its policies in the occupied Palestinian territory in the 1967 areas. At this point, when the Palestinian resistance refused the legitimacy of Zionism, the religious component surfaced. I'd like, in brief, to thank you. I'd like to allude briefly to the 1948 Palestinians. And this relates also to the Mamdani's lecture yesterday. The Palestinians of 1948 were spearheading the resistance as far as being skeptic of the legitimacy. We didn't talk about the two-state solution at the time. Israel has always asked for its recognition. However, the 1948 Palestinians had programs that refused and exposed Zionism frankly and overtly. The Palestinians of the 1948 overtly and frankly refused the Jewish state, and in fact, some of you know that they went to the Palestinian leaders and warned them from recognizing the Jewish state under the umbrella of the two-state solution. Hence, at this point is very important. The Zionist legitimacy relates to the acknowledgement or the recognition of the Jewish state that has been refused by the 1948 Palestinians. Briefly, I'll be talking about the concept of disintegrating or dismantling the settler colonialist project, taking into consideration that the relationship between religion and nationality and settler colonialist projects are interlinked, and there is a dire need of the there's a dire need So there is a precondition for deconstructing the settler colonialist project, and it is to do with dispensing with the religious component that relates to the justification of the establishment of the Jewish state. Deconstructing colonialism necessitates the dichotomy between the nationality and the religion, and for the Jewish nation to understand this issue, it must dispense with the religious claim rather than the religious text. However, these religious claims are entrenched in the psyche of the Jews. And if I go back to Uganda, it would have been possible for the secular transformation of, or the democratic transformation of the settler colonialist project in Uganda as in other context of settler colonialist projects in South Africa and Northern Ireland. Because unlike Zionism in Palestine, the religious claims were not necessary for the continuation of the legitimacy of such envisaged scenarios in the Ugandan scenario. Zionism would have been inherent in utilizing other kind of components, and as I said, Zionism would have become an ambush because it would have needed religious claims in Uganda to perpetuate, to continue. And it would have been very difficult because legitimacy relies on the religious claims, and they will be lacking in the case of Uganda. The the possibility of liberating Zionism from religious claims is unfeasible because it is similar to those who want to liberate capitalism from the market economy or communism from the caste struggle. So this is an organic kind of link, even if some thought that there was a secular period in the beginning. But from my own perspective, it is not impossible to disintegrate this link between the Jewish Israeli nationality away from the religious claims and the settler colonialist project. And I think that this disintegration and this severing between the between a nation that is anti-Zionist, a Jewish Israeli nation that doesn't hinge on the religious claims, and this would be the beginning for a new paradigm on the part of the Israelis in the future of Palestine and the future of the relationship between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rouhana. You raised many questions, especially when you spoke about the religious aspect. In the beginning of the last century, the Zionist organization sent a delegation to Barqa in Libya, headed by a Jewish lawyer who used to live in Tunisia. The the question the delegation wanted to find answers for was Barqa, meaning the eastern parts of Libya, as a place or location for establishing a Jewish political entity. The report is there and is published in French. They wrote a long report of about 25 pages or thereabouts. The conclusion was that no, this area is not suitable for this purpose for two main reasons. First of all, it's for environmental reasons, lack of water resources. Secondly, there was no religious justification that can be used to justify settling this area. This is how they wrote their conclusions in their report, which supports what you've been saying, Doctor. The Palestinians, when they came to Tunisia in 1982, they held meetings with Bourguiba, the president of Tunisia at the time, and they complained that they tell them Palestinians complain that the Jewish people always say that they claim that Israel is ours because it is mentioned in the Torah and in the Quran. Bourguiba was a lawyer by profession. He said to them, ask them, is the Torah is the registry of deeds for properties? If it's so, then they're right. If not, then it's a totally different matter. For this reason, this is part and parcel of the justifications for the establishment of the State of Israel in Palestine. We would like now to open the floor for questions and answers. I suggest first we take 3 questions the presenter can respond to, then we follow that with another round of questions, and we must remember that time is limited, unfortunately. I agreed with Dr. Rouhana to give him 40 minutes, and we secretly negotiated few extra minutes for him. So time is limited. We start with then followed by Nabil Khattab, then Nabil Khattab, and the third question, Dr. Abdul Wahab Al-Effendi. Please go ahead. Please introduce yourselves, and also for people who follow us on YouTube, can شكرا جزيلا Soldabaum in Cambridge. أشكرك.
Find myself in agreement with a great deal of what you say. Just to come back to the comparison with South Africa, it's perfectly true that both some Zionists, the non-secular Zionists, and Afrikaner nationalists compared themselves to the people of Israel and saw themselves as chosen people. And in the case of apartheid, they spent an enormous amount of effort. From the 1930s, the word apartheid was first created by the Christian Mission Church to create a specific Afrikaner Bible, which was later, near the post-apartheid period, renounced by Dutch Reformed Church itself as a heresy. And some of the principles that they enunciated, for example, was, they reinterpreted the history of the Old Testament, the fall of the Tower of Babel, and it was a racialized idea because it said that God, Hamadabil, the divider, resisted this tower, humanist tower, to challenge his strength, and therefore caused people to go into disarray, and the different people speaking different languages to have to live separately and so forth. Now, there are lots of parallels. The difference, I think, is that in the case of Israel-Palestine, we have 3 Abrahamic faiths, all claiming not just the same land, but the same places in the land. And so the land is sacralized in a way that it never was in South Africa. There, the Voortrekkers wanted to go to the interior to represent a Christian light mission and so forth, but they didn't have a specific object of their occupation. It's also true that in the early phases of apartheid, say from 1948 to 1968, the power of the church was enormous. And the Christian Bible was one of the most determining facts. But later, through the post-apartheid, or through the late apartheid period, there was a tremendous move away from this towards a secularism. So it became a different way of justifying white domination, not just Afrikaner religious rights. And I think that the tragedy is that in the case of Israel-Palestine, we see we see the decline of secularism in Israel, a fundamentalism which is not only part of Israeli settlers, although that's a very important component, but also is reiterated by American Christian fundamentalists as well. So it seems to me that this religious comparison is working in different directions and at different times. So I will pick some of that up in the next session, but I do want to thank you, and I thank you too specifically for making the very good point about how it would have been had the place for Jewish settlement been Uganda or Madagascar or Libya. I think that point illuminates the distinction extremely well. So thank you very much, and sorry for going on.
شكرا دكتور نبيل خطاب. أرجو بالنسبة لطرح الأسئلة
when you pose your questions, try and be brief and make your questions pointed. Shukran, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the talk, especially the central theme of your talk. And I also liked it in the Mamdani talk yesterday. There were many comparisons. Maybe at some stage it appeared as if the Zionist case in Palestine is an exception or as part of other cases where religious justifications were used to create a settler colonial reality on the ground. But, however, it was not clear enough, so far as I'm concerned, when the religious justifications for the Zionist settler movement begin. If we refer back to many thinkers, Zionist thinkers and writers before the establishment of the State of Israel, many, many years prior to that, in fact, maybe if we go back to the end of the 18th, the end of 18th century and the middle 19th century, we find Abraham, Mako, and Odessa also was mentioned, is in the Ukraine now. They used to write poems, or Shishai Agnun writes a story, Abraham Map writes a novel, a complete novel, which included many references to religious references in praising the land of Zion, Palestine, and mentions a lot of religious significance, although you clarified that the vast majority of these were secularists. They did not believe in religion per se. And since the establishment of the Zionist movement, when they later on started reviving the Hebrew language as part and parcel of turning this project into a religious one and a cultural one. But is this really an exception if we go back to pre-modernism in the days of the Crusades? The Crusades were colonial settler movements after they occupied most parts of Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, and Jerusalem. They established their kingdoms on religious grounds and justifications. So to what extent are there any differences between Zionism, which justifies its project on religious grounds, and the Crusades, which re-established European settlement in the Levant on religious pretexts? Thank you, Dr. Nadim. My question pertains to 3 points which I found problematic when it comes to religious justification. The first being, in Judaism, there's a group who sees that the return to Palestine or the Promised Land before a sanction from God is an act of religious disobedience or violation of the teachings of religion. Secondly, the Israeli state has always been calling for the recognition of the Jewishness of the State of Israel from others who are not Jews, especially the Palestinians. This contradicts to a great extent the religious aspect of this. There is a third point. We can't hear the speaker because he's not using. Yes, so when you have a religious promise or covenant from God, then what good will a temporal recognition do to you? Also, so far as there are 2 points which can look at together in conjunction. Has settlement become the logic of the Israelis, which is being now instrumentally as a pretext when you say that the secularist Jews used to use religious claims. So as Dr. Sood said about South Africa, sometimes settlement came first, like in South Africa or America, then afterwards there was a search for religious justifications. Thank you very much. These are important questions. They need really a lot of deep thinking and responses, especially when it comes to South Africa. The central question here is all colonial cases in the West needed religious justifications or used religious justifications and pretexts, but that was not, however, the source of their legitimacy, and it was not to be in the future the only need for legitimacy. The need to legitimacy has changed democratically to democratization, to equality, to the engagement of the people who have been colonialized. The religious pretext or justification was the main justification for legitimacy. If you think about it, what other justification can there be for legitimacy? Israel, how can Israel justify continuing its colonialization of the Palestinian lands? I disagree with Dr. Charles that Palestine is different so far as it's the birthplace of the three Abrahamic religions. I completely disagree with you in this. The Palestinian national movement never used religious discourse in its establishment, development, and resistance. It's true that Hamas later on, for conditions we can talk about that, resorted to religious discourse, but the Palestinian national movement has never resorted to that. There is no religious discourse in the documentation and the literature of the national Palestinian movement. So therefore, it has nothing to do with any agreement or disagreement with the three Abrahamic religions. What is correct, however, is for Israel's reliance on what you mean Christian fundamentalism. This goes hand in hand with what happens in Israel, and not because of the support by the extremist Christians. They needed that, or they need that in a historic period to justify or market their project. Nabil Khattab, as you said, the religious claims are present in other projects, but not to this extent. This was in the beginning. They could have changed, and they have changed, but it's still possible that you can find in colonial projects and the remnants of the countries who were founded on colonial projects. But here we're talking about something different. The religious discourse here is the essence. Also, your mention of the Crusades, it's interesting, and it needs a lot of thought. But if you want to compare the Zionist project with, if you want to find another case which needs going all the way back to the Crusades to find an example of justifying colonialism on religious pretext. So this proves to you this point that we're talking about. also, it's not in our hand the change that comes from God or from heavens, as you said. Some of these groups mixed the nationalist discourse with religious discourse, and this group that you're referring to are still there. Some of them are anti-Zionists, but some of them also change their discourse to a nationalist discourse. As for the question of there is a deed from heavens or recognition or covenant from heaven, why should we need an earthly temporal recognition? You need to be recognized for purposes of legitimacy. The feeling of anxiety and worry and insecurity that I mentioned by the Israelis, if you follow the Israeli discourse, they express a fear of the future. This is at the heart of it, a question of the lack of legitimacy. For example, when you say to me, this is a covenant or promise from God or a divine promise, I can say to you, what has that got to do with me? In my opinion, you need the recognition. The trap here is the legitimacy is only religious. In Israel, the legitimacy discourse is only a religious discourse. As for using religion as a pretext, this is a very complex question indeed. Yes, I did not elaborate, but you can use religion as a pretext. And like what Nabil has said in the beginning, the cultural relationship is there. All these writers or literary writers, they wrote about a longing to go to the promised land. This is not a political right. This is a passion. This is a longing. Zionism turned it into a political right. So this is what happened. They used this kind of pretext, whether it's from the Old Testament or whatever, which becomes later on the main source for legitimacy. This is a process, and also you turn what is a religious claim becomes the essence of your source of legitimacy. It's a very complex issue. Thank you, Dr. Rouhana. The time allocated to us on paper has finished, but we take 3 more interventions. And please mention your name and affiliation, because there is translation. Thank you, Dr. Rouhana. I follow your writings. At least what is translated into Arabic. There is a specific question which is not clear enough to me, and that is the Palestinians of 1948. They spoke about the state of the citizens or something in this similar to this. My question is the relationship between the state of citizens is not with Israel. It has something to do with the dynamism of Palestinian struggle in a much longer period of time than what we see now. Is this idea or thought of the state of citizens can lead to, and logically speaking, to a state for the Palestinians after liberation, or can it mean, or can it lead to a democratic state for the Palestinians?
It is a bit ambiguous, but I interpret it as having a temporal and logical relationship. Thank you. Could you introduce yourself, please? Abd Karim from the Doha Institute. I have one or two questions. You have touched upon the issue of legitimacy. Can we say that there are two sides, the legitimacy that relates to the Jews and the utilization of the religious component from the seculars justified the Zionist project from within. There is also the legitimacy that is external. So it is kind of tools for convicting the countries of the world. So there are two legitimacies. The other question, to what extent this is peculiar to the Zionist movement. If we go back to the 13 US states or the federations, the founders, as a matter of fact, talked about religious persecution, and they relied on religion at the time. Nobody thinks that the United States of America's project is religious. However, if we go back 50 years following its establishment, I think there were religious nuances and components. So I'm asking here about the timing of using such religious components. Last question, please. Thank you, Dr. Nadim. Ibrahim Al-Khatib from the Doha Institute, talking about the legitimacy of Israel and its link with the religious discourse and the need to deconstruct it, perhaps is not needed, because we need to define the settler colonialist project by its definition and by its practices. So we perhaps do not need to deconstruct the religious discourse, because it might be applied to different kind of projects. We need to understand the tools that are used by Zionism against the Palestinians. The second point, there is a nationalist project on the part of the Jews, and I think this intersects with the religious discourse as well, because they think of themselves that they are religious and nationalistic at the same time, and sometimes they use the religious component to emphasize their existence. So I think the nation of the Jews is intrinsically linked with the religious ones, and this emblematic to the fact that this link as well is justified, because some people think of the formula of the self-determination issue. Hassan Hajij from Morocco. I just want to address Dr. Nadim with the following question. I've noticed that you haven't used the word indigeneity, and my proposal is as follows. I think that indigeneity is more important than the religious justification. I think that the indigeneity is the most important determined component of what do I mean by the indigeneity? Yeah, the one that relates to the Jews. I'm talking here about the religious justifications of the Jews. I think this is a very important determining element. Thank you. Dr. Rouhana, in brief, please. Yes, we'll start with the last question. I think that indigeneity in Zionism relies on the religious basics, because it goes back to the history and goes back to the religious discourse. You are indigenous because you have been there thousands of years ago, and this is a religious discourse, not only the discourse, the perception, the religious perception. And yes, Zionism believes that the Jews, by and large, are the indigenous people of Palestine. The Palestinians are outsiders. Mr. Shamsuddin, I'll leave your question to the end. Mr. Abdel Karim has talked about two sides of legitimacies. Yes, I think the two are linked organically. It is the same legitimacy because the Israelis do think deeply that the legitimacy is religious, historic, but it is the two sides of the same coin. And I gave you examples of Netanyahu's speech and the Israeli representative at the Security Council and others, Ben-Gurion. But there is an important issue here. I attempted to underscore it in my intervention. Yes, there is a religious discourse within the settler colonialist project, but in Israel it is the basis of the contemporary legitimacy, the cornerstone of the state, the cornerstone of the state that hinges on exclusivity. As I compared this case with other cases, in other cases the religious legitimacy has morphed into democracy and so on and so forth. But in Israel, the religious justification is still there. As you know, there is a relationship between the ethnicity and the religion, and academics talk about moving from the ethnicity and its religious roots into something else. However, the Zionist case, from my own perspective, is different. It is similar to the Hindutva in India, and it is similar to the Serbian ethnicity following the dismantling of Yugoslavia, and so on and so forth. it is linked to the national movement. All national movements can claim that it has remnants of religiosity. However, religiosity is part and parcel of the nationalist movement. Answering Mr. Shamsuddin, yes, the state of citizens, my opinion is as follows. If I talk about Jewish Israeli ethnicity or nationality that can be religious but dispenses with the religious claim of their right in Palestine, I think that this has been there, and the Palestinians must resist the religious claim of the Israelis' right in the Palestine on the basis of religious claims. It is a Jewish ethnicity that claims that it has religious claims in the uh, territories of Palestine. So, does this lead to a state of Palestine? I don't think so. This might lead to a modern state that has two ethnicities, and this contradicts what Mr. Mamdani has said yesterday. I think that Mr. Mamdani wants a political community rather than an ethnicity, and I think this is unfeasible in Palestine. So, unfortunately, my answer doesn't agree with having a state of Palestine that is exclusive. Thank you, Dr. Rouhana, and thank you all. We have another session. Dr. Rima Majid will be managing. Dr. Shurdubu and Ilan Dabi will be talking to us at a later stage. Abdullah Al-Urwi, the late, has said, would it be possible to have new